Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today with Aortic Hope and Aortic Athletes. My name is Carmen David. I am an aortic dissection survivor and an aortic athlete.
And my name is Jack Crow, and I am an aortic dissection survivor and an aortic athlete. You know, Aortic Athletes is the only place in the world where a community of people with aortic disease learn about the science behind exercise and provide one another with peer-to-peer support. And Carmen, good morning.
Hi.
I heard you were at an event last week in Dallas, Texas, near your house about aortic disease. What was that all about?
Yes, that was great. So it was called Dallas Aorta, and it was held at the Baylor Heart Hospital in Plano, Texas, by the John Ritter Foundation and some sponsors there. And it was great. There was a bowling fundraiser that is the third year, I believe, to be held, and that was taking place afterwards. So it was a great time to meet other survivors there and clinicians that were there for a continuing education conference, basically. So I got to see our favorite cardiologist there. Dr. Prakash was there. They had some outstanding speakers. They had Dr. Milowitz, who spoke about genetics. Of course, Dr. Prakash, which debuted our aortic athletes group with the aortic athletes survey and touched on a number of things. His slides for clinicians to kind of get a better understanding for counseling their patients was phenomenal. There was a lot of slides on blood pressure responses, what numbers to go by depending on if they were syndromic or not, and just basically how to better guide them. A lot of the people attending were nurses as well, so first line defense for our patients, and so it was phenomenal.
And we should mention that you and I will be interviewing Dr. Prakash in a few weeks, live right here on YouTube. And Dr. Prakash will provide an update, I think, on his first in class post-aortic dissection exercise study.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. And he's going to talk a little bit too about the connective tissue disorders, and which kind of lines up with what he spoke about at the Dallas Aorta event as well on how to counsel patients. So yeah, that's going to be great. Well, before we turn to our guest today, I wanted to remind everybody to click like below and be sure to join Aortic Hope and Aortic Athletes. You know, we have a lot of videos out there. Aortic Hope does a lot of good support for the community as well. And so you'll just get more wind of all of these experts and advice by tuning into both pages.
And Carmen, we also want to remind people that today's discussion is for educational purposes only. Carmen and I, this is, alert, we're not doctors. You need to get with your medical provider. Joint decision making about diagnosis or treatment, especially about what you should do with exercise. So we encourage folks to see their cardiologists, about exercise in particular.
Yeah, just remember that everybody is unique on their own aortic journey. And so be sure to talk with your cardiologist. And speaking of unique, we have a very unique guest today. Jack, who is our guest today?
Well, I am very excited. We're actually going across the ocean today to Copenhagen, Denmark, to talk with Torbjørn Sindballe. And I can just tell you, like, in the 2000s, Torbjorn was the guy. He came over the ocean to America to compete in Ironman as a professional triathlete. You can't tell from the video here, but he's 6'4". He's a big guy. He's not one of these small little Ironman guys. And he was really tearing it up in the United States. And at the time, I was doing some Ironmans. In fact, we may have overlapped once or twice, maybe at Ironman Wisconsin. But we're really so excited to welcome Torbjorn Sindballe, who's going to tell us his story, not just about being an Ironman. We'll just talk about that a little bit. And then we'll spend really the bulk of the time talking about his aortic journey and, including some interesting surgical interventions recently. So Torbjorn, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Carmen. Thank you, Jack. And thank you for really putting this community together. You know, it's absolutely amazing for me as Just coming off, you could say, surgery in end of October, to be able to tap into all the stories and all the guidance. So thanks a lot to the two of you for putting this together.
Well, I think we have 1,200 members from around the world. So it is truly an international community of folks who just support each other. And it's a pretty beautiful thing. And and you bring a unique perspective a little bit. So why don't you just take us back to the early 2000s? Tell us a little bit. How did a guy from Copenhagen end up going to Kona and going to Hawaii and other places?
Yeah, so that takes me a pretty long way back. I think I got into triathlon in 1990. So I was 14 at the time. I'm 48 today. And basically, I came from a short stint in swimming, and then I came into that, and I was just fascinated by the atmosphere in the sport, combining three disciplines. That's a little bit complex in itself, but the atmosphere was fantastic. So I always say, when you go to one of those races, there's not one winner, there's 2,000. So it's super supportive. And I found basically my bunch of friends in my teens in the sport. So we traveled Denmark or traveled Europe to go racing. And I spent the first 5 or 6 years just learning about the sport, learning to train. That's what you need to do, right? The discipline and everything. And then around 1998, I was selected for the Danish national team. And that was kind of my breakthrough. Went to Japan for my first World Championships on the long distance. And then kind of this next phase of my career took off from there, called it Learning to Compete. Was the youngest ever to win a medal at a World Championships in 1999 in Säter in Sweden. Won 2 World Championship titles in 2004 and 2006 on what's called the long distance. That's a 6-hour-ish race, 5.5, 6 hours. And then at the end of my career, or the latter stage of my career, I moved up to the Ironman distance. And really had a big dream and set a big goal of winning in the Ironman in Kona. So I had a lot of racing in the US, both at the half Ironman distance and the Ironman distance, and had some amazing experiences. There's a big spring race in California, the half Ironman California. I won that twice. I came to Kona for the first time in 2004. That's a very difficult race. It's super hot. It's super humid. And coming there for the first time, I knew, it's a learning experience. But nevertheless, I ended up making it in 6th place, which was pretty good. So that gave me some confidence and some motivation to keep going. Next time I came around was in 2005 with a slight injury. But the heat hammer got me. So I ended up in 55th place or something like that. And then slowly I made my way back. In 2007, I made it to the podium. Even as a big guy. So managing the heat there was a big thing. And I had like 4 or 5 races in a row where I would drop, 10 miles into the marathon. In the end, I would just go totally down from the heat. So I ended up actually figuring out that running in a long white sleeve shirt that you spray with water, but also wearing latex gloves and putting ice in them actually helped me cool my core temperature, because that was my problem. And that helped me make it to the podium in 2007. So lots of great experiences in that part of my life.
Well, the adjustments that you make, maybe they foreshadow the adjustments you had to make because of aortic disease. But you really became a kind of you were a student of the race, not just from a competitive point of view, but from a science and a physiology point of view. Talk a little bit about how you just approach that endurance thing, and maybe it's going to foreshadow a little bit about how you've come out the other end here.
Yeah. No, I think I've always been like very into data and science and reading about stuff I don't know what it's about. Basically approached, I would say, my condition in the same way. But I've always been fond of that. I've always been very super curious, just wanted to understand how things work. That was a big approach in my career. So both in terms of the training, the nutrition, the equipment, everything around mobility and technique. And in this case also, how do we overcome that heat challenge? Because really what we figured out along the way. Of course, when you're in the heat, you need to ensure that you have your fluid is in balance, right? You need to drink enough. You need to have enough electrolytes. But in the end, the challenge was that, in those types of conditions in Kona, like you're saying, I'm 6'3" or 4", and weighing at the time 80 kilos. I think, what is that, 180 pounds or something, in race weight. So I couldn't lose any more weight. And the challenge was running, at normal marathon speeds at the end of an Ironman in those conditions. My body temperature would just go up. So basically, at the start, I started with a problem I couldn't do anything about because I couldn't cut off a leg and then keep running, right? So to reduce my body mass. And then we came up with some of those solutions, and they helped me drop from 3:12, 3:15 on the marathon to 2:57. And because I was always, very strong biker, so I usually could take 10 minutes out on everybody else on the bike, that could give me the podium back then.
So those are lessons I never learned during being a participant, not a competitor in the Ironman. So I just got slower and slower and slower, and would lose like 10 or 15 pounds during an event, and and end up with grueling experience, which was kind of typical. Carmen, go ahead.
Wow. Yeah, I had never heard of such a thing. Of course, I'm not an Ironman, so I don't know anything else about it either per se, but I have never heard of that with other friends of mine who have been in Ironman events. But yeah, that's incredible. So tell us about how you first were diagnosed. How did you know that you had a problem, and what was the early diagnosis that you had?
This was actually while I was a pro athlete. So in 2005, during a swim session, I had quite significant pain in my chest. And we got quite scared because at the time, there was a lot of Swedish orienteering runners who had, they dropped dead in the woods. Not many, but there were some cases, and those stories were circulating because they had some sort of infection, and probably then had carditis, and dropped dead because of it. So we were pretty scared. So we went to a cardiologist and got checked out. And it showed up, actually, it was not an infection or anything. It was just a pinched nerve in my back that radiated into the front of the chest. But we then discovered that I had a bicuspid aortic valve at the time. And I even had a mild leak. So 10% at rest, 10% of the blood was flowing back into the heart, or dropping back into the heart. And I had I think my aorta at the time was 42 or 43 millimeters. So still dilated, but given my body size and what I was doing, as long as it didn't progress, they were okay with me continuing also professional sports at that level. I had that with me from birth. So basically, having 10% of your heart has to work 10% more. That inefficiency goes down when your heart rate goes up. But still, I need to do 4 or 5% more blood needs to come around the body than compared to people with normal hearts. But my body was able to adapt to it and still deliver fantastic results in the triathlon arena. So I learned about it then, and carried on for 4 years more. And then in 2009, I'd switched coaches to a much more an approach that was not focusing so much on training, the longer the harder, but more training with quality and training with technical quality, which worked well. I did a Wildflower, which is a big half Ironman distance triathlon in California.
Another one we might have done together.
Yeah, maybe. That's an amazing race, basically into the forest and at a lake in nature. But at the race, I had I had an incident, so to speak. So I would go out, swim fine, and on the bike, I couldn't get my heart rate quite up where I normally would put it. And then during the bike course of 56 miles, that would get worse and worse and worse. But usually I would be at 155, 160 in a race like this, and that dropped to 150, then it dropped to 140. And at the time, I trusted, I had no idea it was about my heart because I'd lived with that for 4 years and there'd been no changes. I had a checkup in February. This was May. February checkup was fine. There was no changes in anything. But then in May, I had this, and at the end of the bike ride, I was doing 110 in heart rate, and I was hyperventilating, and I had tingling in my arms and around my mouth. And then I kind of collapsed when I got into the second transition. Spent 45 minutes in the medical tent and woke up again and saw the other people finish the race. And initially we thought it was something around minerals or salts or electrolytes. But then as I came home, you know, the doctor on the Team Denmark, which is the governing elite body for elite sports in Denmark, he wanted me to go to see a cardiologist. And we found out that the leak at the valve had progressed. So I had a moderate leak, so 30% of the blood flowing back into the heart. And the aorta was also slightly dilated. And then my left ventricle had grown substantially from February to May. So it had grown 10 millimeters. So I came in and had one of the biggest hearts that they had ever seen, because I had an athlete heart already, and now it had grown. I think it was 74 millimeters in the left ventricle, and that was like out of the charts for them. So that led to me stopping the sport. And of course, that got me scared, for sure, because that's different.
So you had a incidental finding that first diagnosed the bicuspid. Yeah. And, you know, our friend and cardiologist colleague, Dr. Alan Braverman, has done the first study on bicuspid. People have just bicuspid repair, no aneurysm. And they seem to be able to return to endurance events well. So you had the incidental finding. And then the other thing that's kind of interesting to me is, you know, most people are completely asymptomatic. I certainly was before I dissected. I didn't know what an aorta was. But you had this kind of wake-up call at Wildflower. So you were kind of lucky in two ways, as opposed to those poor Swedes in the woods who just kind of dropped.
Exactly. And actually the problem initially was the leak, the insufficiency at the valve. That was the big problem, and that was what they were, you know. So I went into evaluation: should I have surgery at the time, or not, or, you know, it was also a question, should I continue sports? But I pretty quickly found out that was not an issue. We did a lot of, you know, examinations of that. At that time, it was not as advanced as today. So doing an MR where you measure actually the leak was pretty difficult, or an MRI when you measure it. But in the end, I decided to stop my career. I couldn't really continue with that because it was pretty clear that the training load, the heart couldn't handle that anymore. And then I detrained. And then the big question was, would it evolve or not? It didn't. So it stabilized. And then for the first 5 or 6 years after that, it was basically down to, would the valve become more insufficient? That was a key question, because the aorta was not that big at the time, or was big, but it was not that big. I think it was 44, 45 millimeters. And that was kind of not at a level of surgery, but the valve was the key issue in the beginning.
So what did they tell you? What did they tell you specifically about the exercise? You know, you say you decided to stop and retire at that point, but was it more based on what they told you, or just knowing the insufficiency that was happening?
Yeah, it was a shared decision. And I think that I was really happy with that. Have I been born in Italy, I would have been banned for racing in 2005. And I would not have liked that. I really cherish the experiences I had after that, and I don't regret anything, even with how things have gone, because it is something I'm born with. And all the studies that are done on elite athletes with this condition does not show a correlation between elite sports and this, you know, and the development of a bicuspid aortic valve. You know, in my case, doing an extreme sport like that, there probably is. So maybe I have had surgery 10 years before I would otherwise have it, but I'm pretty certain I would have a surgery, you know, either way. So that's it. But basically they have pretty solid guidelines for competitive sports. So depending on the condition you have, and they're actually pretty interesting also for the group. You know, Jack, we spoke about that. It's pretty interesting actually to see what kind of sports are good with which conditions in which stage, right? And it's pretty clear. If I had a moderate leak at this time, and no implications on the left ventricle size, so that's really, if that grows, then of course you're in trouble. Then I could have basically continued if I wanted to. But because the left ventricle had shown that was under the load of a big insufficiency, then, you know, they kind of said that's not a good sign. But I made the decision in the end. and said, but they said the only thing I wanted to do was to have one more shot in Kona. I considered that, but the consequence was I would have to go to them every 3 weeks to get checked. And I thought, I can't mentally prepare, and I won't do it. It's totally off the charts. So that was it. And then it was, all the weeks of months of detraining and finding into a new lifestyle where I could do moderate exercise. It was basically, at that time, it was down to, does the heart grow, or is it the same size?
How old were you then? How old were you when you?
I was 32.
You were
32 at the time, yeah. So I could do more. I couldn't lift heavy. I could do moderate exercise. So I basically got rid of all my heart rate monitors and everything. Didn't measure anything, just went by feel. In the beginning, I still did like 5 sessions a week of an hour and a half, 2 hours, because my body was used to doing 20, 30, 35 hours of training a week. And so I had to kind of detrain. And over time, that became probably, now I do 3 bike rides and did that into the surgery of an hour to 2 hours, and then a little bit of stability work. So that's been more or less the guidelines I had was that moderate exercise, but nothing like we need to really fine tune or anything. It was just, I could still, back then I could still actually do, if it was not on a regular basis, I could still do a maximal effort, for example, because the left ventricle wouldn't grow from that. So that was more or less okay. But then later on, down the years, so I was spent 15 years in watching weight before I had surgery. And the aorta then, after 5 or 6 years, that started to grow, initially from 44, 45 to 48-ish, and then up to around 49, 50. That was back in 2016. So at that time, then it started to become a little bit more, but more or less the same. I couldn't do maximal stuff anymore, but moderate was still fine. And then from 2016 all the way until now, it was basically around 49 to 50 millimeters.
We
and
didn't
then it
ask
grew in
about,
the end.
we didn't ask about, and Joshua's going to interrupt if he gets any questions from our live audience here. But any family history, father, mother, uncle, sudden onset deaths?
That's what I was
Yeah,
gonna
yeah.
ask you, and about your height. Did any
Yeah.
of that factor in with your doctors taking a look at your family history and your physical appearance or anything like that?
Yeah. So I there's nothing in my, in my family history around having a bicuspid aortic valve that I know of. So, when we go way back, of course, people didn't necessarily know. Nobody has dropped dead. Both my father and my grandfather had issues with hypertension, and did have, one of them had a bleeding in the brain, my granddad, and my father had a like more of a, what do you call that, a blood clot in his in cerebellum, so in the small brain, in the 60s. So there's definitely, but their lifestyles, and they were obese, and lifestyles were much worse than what I've been doing. So part of that could be explained for that, but it is likely that I have something hereditary around hypertension and maybe something around the whole vascular side, but I don't know other than that. But in terms of my heart, Carmen, you're right, and I think that what happened then in the end was, if we just go back a little less than a year, and we come to Christmas last year, so in November, so my echocardiograms had gone up, over a couple of years, they've gone from 50 to 51, 52, 53, 54. And it really, I looked into it, it's still really that the absolute measure. Then it's right if you're smaller, and particularly if you're a woman, the measurements might be different, and you might need to correlate to the height. And also if you're larger than me, that may factor in as well in the evaluation. But they still have a pretty, many of the studies show that correlation between the diameter of the aorta and risk of dissection. But around Christmas, it was time, and they said, the echoes now are like 52, 53. And I had a hypertension at the time, mild, but I still had it. It was medicated, so it was under control. And they said, now we think it's time. And then they do a conference on it. And that came back, and they were a little bit, more back and forth. So they needed to line up all the MRs and all the CTs be done over the last 3 or 4 years. And they came back and say, hey, when we line those up from 2016 until now, they're more or less the same. There's no change when we look at the most accurate measure we have, which is a CT or an MRI. So it actually ended up, they told me, we don't think it's now. And I told them, if you can give me 8 or 10 years, then I don't want it now. But if it's about a year, I want to go now, because we were ready at the time. But they said, hey, we of course, we can't say for certain, but there is a chance you'll get 5 years or 8 years or maybe even 10 years still before anything happens. And then I went to the next checkup in June, and then it gone up 2 millimeters on the CT.
And what was it at that point?
F52.
5.2, okay.
Yeah, and at the time, they changed all the European guidelines, so they made a completely new set of guidelines coming out in August 2024. So they're very new, and they have a pretty neat chart. Back to your comment in terms of the different, for men and women and the sizes of the ascending order. There's really one where you're yes or no, and you go down through it, and you can really see what kind of risk factors do you have. It's a very, very informative, I would say, way they presented it. And that helped me a lot to see, even being under 50, that was basically a reason to do it now rather than later, because you handle the surgery better this time and stuff like that.
Right.
So from that, it was pretty clear that with the growth in just those 6 months, and with the size of 52, with the bicuspid valve, which typically would tend you go a little sooner than the normal 55, then it was there. But then it took a couple of months to get all that sorted, and then I went in on October 31st.
Wow. Well, before we jump to that, I wanted to go back to the waiting period. So
yeah,
what did you face any, so many patients have fears during that watch and wait period after diagnosis. So did you have fears during that time, and while you were competing from that, what was it, you said 2009 all the way up till 16?
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
I definitely had, and I think that's a good question. So if we start going back to 2009, I had anxiety. So 12 days after the incident in Wildflower, I got a panic attack, thinking that, okay, my heart is going to stop. Everything went off on me. And I went into the ambulance, 32 years old, got nitroglycerin under my tongue, went to the hospital, got the full checkup. Basically, nothing was wrong other than, what I had. So I was not dying at the time, but I thought I was dying. So I got really, scared from that. And over the next 6 to 9 months, I had, I was still running, for example, and I could have in the middle of a run, something would feel a little odd in my body, and I would just be hit by lightning. Sort of stop straight there and think, okay, it's not going anymore. And then
out of fear, you just stopped what you were doing.
Yeah, exactly. Stop there and then think, okay, what's going on? So that was a period of 6 to 9 months. And I think a lot of people that find out they have a more severe heart condition, I think that's pretty natural. And I think it is something you have to get through. Now, there was a couple of things that helped me. First of all, of course, I had a good contact with my body, etc. But you don't know the sensations. What should I really pay attention to, and what's not important? And it's very, psychosomatic, right? So when you have anxiety, you start feeling all kinds of stuff in your body. But I had a really good doctor at the time, and I think one of the things that stuck with me, and he said that all the way back when I went into the ambulance 12 days after the event in Wildflower, he said, if anything serious happens, you're not in doubt. So anything, and I don't know that goes for everybody, but he said that to me, and that really helped me, because that said all the small sensations you have, all the nickels, all the kind of, different weird feelings that you have at that time, if it was something where, I wouldn't be doubted if it was serious. And that helped me actually just deal with all those tingling sensations and everything, and then keep on going. And over the time, they faded away. And that was one thing. And the other thing was, she emphasized to me, the heart is a muscle. What you have developed very slowly, so it won't hit you from day to day. The heart is a muscle. It'll keep beating. It'll keep, doing what it does. So with what you have, you don't have any reason to worry as long as you stay inside the guidelines. Now, that's different in the end. So this was basically figuring out I have a heart condition that was serious, and the development of that and all the anxiety around that. but I could leave that after 6 or 9 months. And then for the next 14 years, I would have a great exercise routine. I'd be happy about that. I was not, at that time, usually around checkups. So I went to checkups every 6 months. I would get a little anxious and see, okay, any developments and stuff like that, particularly in the beginning, the first 4 or 5 years. But then later on, when things were stable and stuff, I was pretty okay. But then in the end, when it grew, so when the period from we figured out it was 52 millimeters, and it had grown 2 millimeters from January till June, or December to June, they told me you can't do push-ups anymore. And I think, okay, that's serious. If you can't do push-ups, you do that twice a week normally. So from then on, I got quite a lot of also psychosomatic things. So I had 3 or 4 times during the day, I would have these kind of jolts into my stomach or up behind the chest. And every time I would go, okay, it's dissecting. It's not, this is, it's wrong. And then 2 seconds later, you catch your breath and okay. It's just, your mind playing with you. But that was not nice. And then the whole, prep for the surgery and all the anxiety and all the risks involved. They had a lot I spent a lot of time with those.
New aortic athletes will frequently join, and they have a 4.1 aneurysm. And they sometimes what they want is a solution.
Yeah.
They can go back to doing whatever they were doing before this diagnosis. And you had to live with extraordinary patience for 15 years. I mean, in a way, that's such a big success story because you didn't dissect. And and I think it's also interesting that you were sort of calibrating your exercise depending on what was happening with your body. So you weren't just, you weren't still going all out like you were when you were a pro. And towards the end, you were even really ratcheting things back, which I think makes a lot of sense if you're heading to surgery.
Yeah, for sure. And really going by, how do I feel? Like, what's my intuition telling me? And I think another point which has been very important to me all the way through, and this is not necessarily for everybody that wants to do it that way, but I've always felt that one very important coping mechanism have been to educate myself. So the more I know about my conditions, the more I read all this, more or less all the studies that are related to this. I read the guidelines. So I try to educate myself in my condition. And particularly in the latter stages coming into the surgery and also after the surgery, I've tried to reflect quite a lot on when I have something that makes me worry or makes me scared or makes me anxious about stuff. I try to reflect, okay, what is that? What is it actually you're scared of? Is it, the exercise? Is it this pain from the surgery? Is it when you wake up and you have a tube in your throat, or is it, what will I be able to do afterwards? I have that reflection with myself, and then I try to figure out. And in many cases, you can find, solid guidelines or solid evidence that helps you. Or you can ask your doctor, of course, you should do that as well. But really, in many cases, doctors can play a very important role in really reducing the anxiety people have by making a lot of this guidance. And I did that, and that helped me a lot because I knew exactly what's the risk of what and what levels can I go to, etc. And that clarity helped me a lot.
I'm like you. I'll turn over to Carmen in a second. I'm like you. I want more information. I want to know everything, and then I can make a decision jointly with my doctor. I have a buddy who was a training buddy of mine. Known for years, did Ironman. He went to Kona, unlike me. I was never going to get there. But he has an aneurysm, and he says reading aortic athletes makes him more nervous. Yeah. He doesn't want to think about it. No. He doesn't want to. He doesn't want to. And so it's. I guess there's different strokes for different folks. I don't know.
There is for sure. There is for sure, and that's what I also said. This is for some. And if you're okay reading about the actual risks and the numbers in that, etc., that can be a coping mechanism for some. But for others, it's maybe most important to find the best doctor you can and then just trust them and rely on that and and just go with that, and then try to forget about it. It's very individual, I think. But
Yeah,
for me,
I like
it was
I like how you said that though, because there's a lot of people who, you know, we do try to encourage people to learn about it, because the better knowledge you have about the condition, then you're able to equip yourself with proper questions when you go to see your surgeon or
exactly.
your cardiologist. And then meeting people like yourself or other stories in the group can really help give people advice as well on doing that. Well,
And
so you told us. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was just, I'm just saying it's on this, but it's also on all the more softer things. So for example, when I had to decide on what valve to go with, do we want a bioprosthetic valve or a mechanical valve? You know, they had in the Heart Association in Denmark, they had a guy I could call who had, you know, he had the surgery at 30 and again at 40 with a mechanical valve. So I called him up and said, how's it like living on the valve with the meds and everything, you know? So those types of things, and reading in this forum about people's stories is a big help, because you can kind of see, okay, how are they thinking about it? Or you find a piece of information that's really valuable in your situation. Or let's say you have 4.1, yeah, and of course that can be different. That's an individual assessment. But if another person then has 4.5 and are happy, that helps you as well, because do I need to worry at 4.1 or should I not worry? There's a lot of uncertainty in that, as you say, Carmen, and educate yourself around that. That can be a big help.
Yeah. Well, so you told us a little bit about how you handled it and coped, but tell us about your family, your friends, you know, your inner circle. Like, how did they cope with your training and your being in competition, knowing that you had this diagnosis?
Yeah. I think in the first, so from 2005, it was in the end really a non-issue. And I don't think I could have been a competitive athlete if it had been an issue, because you need to really trust and rely on your body. So at the time they said, you know, you're born with this, your heart has, you know, reconfigured itself to do this. And as long as we measure it and there's no development, there's no issue at all. This is just how you naturally are. Thinking back, you know, I was definitely in an athlete's mindset at the time, where you're mentally tough and you're used to handle any kind of adversity that comes your way in a positive, you know, just going forward. But at the time, of course, when we figured out we need to survey that, but very quickly that kind of settled down. But then when the development happened in 2009, that was definitely a period for my wife and I. We had several other things going on in the family. So that was where we really moved together as a couple around that. Her dad was terminal with cancer at the same time, and we had our second child at the same time. So that was a very emotional period for us, but really spending the time together, processing through everything. For us, it was a big thing. It was like my livelihood or our livelihood that we needed to kind of figure out a way through, and all the things that went into that. It's a big identity shift. It's a big transition. Going out of professional sports, having a global network of people around that, it requires a lot of passion and dedication. And then suddenly, you know, changing overnight. It's a good way to leave the sport, because it's kind of on this date, I'm no longer a triathlete. But I think it took me a year until I was, you know, health-wise in a good place and felt safe and felt balanced again and figured out new ways of income. But I think it took me 7 years identity-wise before I was kind of in a different, working with what I do now with leadership development and everything. So that was a big thing. And then I think, you know, around the whole surgery, it's been, first of all, my wife has been absolutely amazing. Absolutely. It's been we've come very, you know, even though we've been married for 25 years this summer, and it just keeps growing. Our love keeps growing, and that's amazing. In terms of my daughter, we had some things with that, because initially she didn't want to go to the hospital. You know, she didn't want to visit me. So we made some plans for her, saying she has very good couple of friends where she's very good with the parents as well of that friends. And that's where she wanted to stay while I was there. But she couldn't put it into words, even though she's 15, but she couldn't really put a lot of words into it. But we talked to her, I talked to her, and just, you know, feeling where I was in it. I had done my study and everything. So I was, you know, pretty prepared and in a good place. And that, of course, I hope helped her calm down. We spoke to her teachers. So we kind of, all the way around, everybody knew what was going on, and that she would have some outages or whatever, how she would react to this. And we had conversations along the way, which she handled pretty well. We also talked about the risks, etc., which she handled pretty well. And then in the end, she actually ended up coming in the morning of the surgery. And there was a little bit of drama around that because initially I was scheduled to the 29th. And they spent a whole day of prep, and then you sleep there. And then the next day, you go into surgery in the morning. But they came back and say, okay, we've had a patient coming in who need a mechanical heart, and we have some of the surgeons who are ill, so we can't operate you today. And then we had to go home. And then they offered a slot 7 days later, and then 2 days later, and then we took that. But my daughter ended up going to the hospital, and in the morning before surgery, so say goodbye, etc. And then actually she chose to come back, and she was at the ICU, and she was with me every day in the hospital, and she did amazing. And she actually got so inspired she wanted to become a nurse. So that was so really, she was not into it in the start, but as soon as she kind of felt what it was, she was in good state. And she is actually quite a tough cookie when it comes to that. So that was important for us too, that she felt good. My son is 23 and lives in another city, so we had him on the phone, we had him on FaceTime, etc. And he came over, at the end of the stay, etc. So he was fine along and pretty. When his dad said it was okay, and that's what needed to happen, it was fine. So
there's
that's
a
very
great,
inspirational. Let's go ahead and catch up. Let's catch up to some chat here. First off, we're going to say hi to people in the chat. We've got Tom, Brad, Christina, Brian, Velda, Greer, Ed, Becky. Did I say Brian? No, that was Brad. Brian, Bruce, Ed's there, and Molly. Brian had a question. He says, I was just about to ask about family history. Barring that, is there anything that in hindsight you feel like you could have done to be more engaged in your heart health? No?
No.
Okay.
I don't think so. I think, like I said, I don't regret anything about my career. That could be one thing, saying, should I have stopped in 2005, for example, and that kind of, those experiences that came from that and everything, I wouldn't have missed that, even though it meant that going through surgery at the time. Other than that, I basically, after the first period of 6 to 9 months with anxiety and understanding about the condition I had, etc., I've lived a great life in the watch and wait period until the end. I would say that was difficult in terms of the decisions, etc. I've tried to live healthy. I think I've definitely worked too much at times. I'm a passionate person, so I get engaged in the work I have. But I have, from my career, I have a very good sense of my body. So when you're an athlete, your body is your livelihood. It's what you do every day, and you have so much knowledge about it. That has definitely helped me a lot to navigate a lot of this along the way and stayed within barriers. So I think there are definitely times where I've worked too much and had too much stress compared to what was good for my heart. But I also took the choices over the last 3 or 4 years to come into a different role with not that much leadership responsibility and make some of those adjustments and come into something that was more balanced. So it's been a natural way of making those choices along the way, I would say. And on the other hand, not letting the condition control, anything about my life. It has to be a good balance between what you would like. And I think that's also from post-surgery and from people's choices. You need to figure out what's right for you.
That's excellent. He says, and related to that, is there any advice you would give to other endurance athletes to help them be more aware of potential heart health issues? Yeah.
I actually did an article on that probably 10 years ago by now. And of course, there are all the markers, if you become breathless or have severe chest pain and stuff like that. So all the classic markers of that something is wrong, that's important. But back then I did an article which Larry Creswell, who's a US heart surgeon, was part of and reviewed, where at the time, anytime there's a marathon and somebody dies because there's 40,000 people there, and then somebody will die of a heart thing, if you had that many people together. There was a story in the newspapers or whatever. And also, of course, does extreme sports like that, does that actually, provoke different heart conditions? And the thing was that, today it's back in 20 years ago, 25 years ago, cardiologists did not like that the heart grew through sports, because usually you only do that when it was, you had a condition of some sort. But today we know that having an athlete's heart where the whole heart grows stronger from training is okay. And that will go down again once you detrain from really training a lot. The issue we found back then, and the only thing where we can actually find studies that underpin that sports, extreme sports, elite sports, had an impact on your heart health, was that there was a proportion when you have an elite athlete career and you continue in endurance sports, marathon, triathlon, whatever, and you continue to train 10, 15, 20 years more, then you see more people with AFib or arrhythmias in the atrium than normal. That also has a hereditary effect, etc. But that is the risk you have if you train for that long. Other than that, it's important that most forms of exercise are super healthy, etc. But it has to be quite extreme from what we looked into that. We didn't look into strength, sports and stuff like that, or contact sports, but mainly endurance sports. So you have to be aware of the symptoms, definitely the classic ones that everybody should be aware of. But other than that, exercise is healthy. It's good for your body, so it shouldn't be a limitation.
I agree with that. But this is excellent because this goes into Ed's question, who says, so after your aortic repair, what does your exercise regimen look like now for you?
Yeah. So I think maybe, first of all, I think preparing for surgery is a big thing. And for me, it was basically the same, figure out what it's about and talk to the surgeons as much as I could, etc. But of course, the period after surgery is rough. We've all been through it. In my case, it was a bit challenging in some points, actually. So I had a very big heart also coming into surgery. And then I had a 30% leak that was then a 0% leak. But the valve is also smaller than it was before, and the aorta is replaced, so that's also smaller than before. And the remodeling, as they call it. So the heart needs to adapt to all of that. And that's when you've done the valve, that's what the heart needs to go through. And that's quite different, I think, from when you have only done the aorta. And in my case, also a heart that's worked that hard for 30 plus years, that has taken a lot of time, and still has. So I've had a lot of pounding. That's normal also in this. But what I did have, which was a little bit unusual for them, I had a lot of pain. So usually where I had the surgery, they would send people home after 5, 6, 7, 8 days on just normal painkillers. And in my case, that didn't work at all. So I had 3 or 4 weeks on oxys, and had a lot of pain in my breathing for that. And they said the taller you are, the younger you are, and the more well-trained you are, typically the more pain you have. It's not traumatic. So I say, I could go through it again and still be a sound person. So you'll get through it. And this is not everybody who has that much pain. And of course you have pain, but they're managing it. And that helps a lot. So I don't think you should be too scared about it, because they will help you. But in my case, that was an issue. But they basically told me, you can get on the bike when you come home. Easy, of course, very easy. They said within your, level of speaking, and I said, that's not going to work for me, because I can go very high intensity before my speaking is impaired. So I tried for the first 2 weeks actually to go on the bike 3 times a week for 20 minutes, very slow, very, very easy. And then the walks that started at 200 meters or 20 yards and grew from there. So you start at the bottom, so to speak. And then after a couple of weeks, I had an AFib attack 3 days in a row, went to the hospital on the last day, and then I decided I'm not going to bike anymore until I've rested more. And then I rested for 4 weeks, and then I picked up biking again after 6 weeks, and then did 20 minutes at the time listening to my body. At the time, I was also walking 2 times a day for a mile or 2, and that was fine. And I noticed that over the weeks, my walking pace picked up and became more normal. I also did an exercise program I got from the hospital, just shoulder stuff to release and mobilize your chest. I did them, rigorously, or not rigorously, but I did them consistently 3 times a day. They helped a lot on the pain. So I really recommend just take their program and do that. That worked fantastic. So I had kind of all that going. And then after 6 weeks, the sternum was not quite, that's after 8 weeks. But then I started to add a little bit on that. So I gradually upped the biking to 30 minutes, 35, 40, 45 minutes. So after maybe 10 weeks, I was at that level, biking 45 minutes 3 times a week. I've added a little bit to the exercises. So I built into within the limits of saying, keep it light, keep it mobilizing, etc. But I added to the exercises. So I started to work a lot on the things that I knew would build my body up, and now make it a little nerdy, but no activation, no stretches. I worked on my feet. I worked on everything that could basically improve my body function. And then I went from there. And today I'm kind of biking 3 times a week for an hour and a half. So I'm back to close to my usual routine, but I'm far from at the same level. That will take a lot more time, which is fine. And then I do, a little bit more build out sort of core stability program, including some lunges and stuff, but only body weight, and a little bit work with elastics. And then I'll build on that further. So it's basically consistent and very slow and gradual progression. Listening to what the doctors say, and then slowly moving with the things I can, really working with them, and then building on top. So that's where I'm at now. And then I think the fitness the heart will adjust itself as we go along. I think it'll take a full year before I'm kind of hopefully back to where I was, not in 15 years ago, but just before surgery. But whatever comes, I'll take it. So that's one of the things you end up with, saying whatever you have is good enough.
I like something that Jack says. He says, little by little by little. It's one of my favorite things.
Yeah. And there's also, if you're used to training, and I read a lot of posts about that, people who, of course, and that's a little bit more difficult if you're used to lifting heavy, for example. That's something you can't do to the same extent post-surgery, but that is probably something you can do, right? So it's more also like you're saying, don't quit, adapt. But what are the things you can work on that makes you happy? And then really go into those and build those out. And for me, if I couldn't kind of do sort of the normal strength routine that I would do, I didn't do that much before surgery, but I want to do more now. Then work on the flexibility, work on the mobility, work on the stability, work on all the things that can help your body function better. And then as time will go, you can come into more of what you like in some areas. Not everything, because of course we have restrictions that we need to agree upon with the doctors, but we can still do quite a lot, I would say.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Brian earlier said wildflower is the best. I forgot to throw that in there. Brad says, what advice do you give other athletes who are struggling with letting go of performance-based goals? How did you approach redefining your identity when you realized the risks were too high?
Yeah. That's a big one. I think, first of all, it takes time. So I think it's a personal reflection process. I have really used people around me a lot. So to talk to them, to really use the people that are close to you, but also experts or whatever you need to talk to about making some of those changes. It is tough initially. So I see a lot of people on the forum, for example, that are used to lifting heavy, and now they're looking into surgery, maybe now, maybe later, and they can't lift any anymore. That's a real transition. That's not funny. And that's a real life change. Now I had that when I ended sports, and I spent the first 6 months, I would say my wife says I spent quite a lot of time in the hammock, because for me, just processing my emotions and figuring things out, what can I do? What can't I do? What should I do? So allow yourself time for reflection, allow yourself time for dialogue with the people close to you, seek knowledge, and then eventually you will get through. But it's those types of transitions, they take a lot out of you, but you will get through, and you will get to a stage where you are good again, so to speak, right? Whatever you can plan for. So have a plan B. If you know something is coming up, what's your plan B? Can you plan beyond a surgery or whatever you know is coming at a time? So to have a plan for what's going to happen when XYZ happens can be important. And I think for me, one coach or one friend I have gave me great things about transitions. And he said, you cannot change your life 180 degrees, in a day or so. You change it 1 degree at a time. So, it will, those big things that are important to you that has to change, that's something that happens over time, and it's 1 degree at a time. And that helped me a lot, I think, in my career transition and everything. And then eventually you start telling a different story about yourself, and you'll start finding other passions, and you start feeling more balanced, and you'll start feeling good again and good about yourself. But you need support. And
that 1 degree at a time, I think, applies also to people who have been sedentary.
Yeah.
And now need to get into exercise more. And
Definitely.
I love when we interviewed Dr. Caputo from the Cleveland Clinic, a vascular surgeon there. He said, you don't just become an aortic athlete.
No. I usually say the first 5K is the toughest. So people who go from running 0K to running 5Ks, they have my biggest admiration.
That's excellent. We have a few more coming in here. Becky says, did you have any trouble establishing what moderation in training and exercise meant? And then she says, I think you have now mostly answered my question.
Yeah, maybe. I think, but of course, I would say post-surgery, it's difficult, right? Because doctors throw around all kinds of things. I think before surgery, I played it by feel. So I would say, and I had a pretty good understanding of my intensity levels and intensity zones, so I knew what moderate was, etc. And in the beginning, it was about, not doing consistent hard training. I could more or less do what I wanted as long as I didn't compete, and I didn't do interval training 3 times a week. But then later on, of course, and particularly in the final with the aorta, then it becomes more important to really regulate it. And then I couldn't do push-ups and stuff. I just followed the doctor's guidelines at the time with a little bit of feel to it. But post-surgery, I think, is very difficult, because I've heard anything from 60% max heart rate to 80% max heart rate to 160, diastolic blood pressure to 180 diastolic blood pressure. So that's what I'm still figuring out. Initially, I wasn't on beta blockers, but now I got on them post the arrhythmia, and that slows everything down. But that also helps with that thing, because basically it's hard to go, anything that's going to, again, this, you have to discuss it with your doctor, because there are differences, right? Some people have more restrictions than others. But for me, where I have not dissected, post it was an elective surgery. I don't have family history. I don't have some of the connective tissue disorders, except for bicuspid, which is sort of in the middle. So right now, I don't look to be in the very restricted group. So I'm going more or less with, I'm on beta blockers, and then around the 80% max heart rate. Over time, I may get up higher. I'll discuss that with my doctors, but we'll see. But that's where I'm for now. And earlier, it was probably more like 60%. In the 8 to 12 weeks, right? So that was more restricted.
Yeah, I like what you said about, that you're still figuring out your numbers, because like you said, you may be in a less restricted status because of what your condition, what the diagnosis was versus a syndromic or a dissection. But I think a lot of times people can find that in time, like you said, it was like 60%, and now even just a short time later, you're up a little bit. So I want to encourage people that things can change over time, and time is telling. I mean, when you have stats on your Garmin that you're watching your heart, you know, your blood pressure at home and your CT scan follow-ups, you just, to keep hope that you still can gradually, like you said, a degree at a time, get to a place where maybe there's not certain specific numbers and it is more like how you feel or something like that. But to be sure to talk to your cardiologist each step of the way.
Yeah.
In English, we have a word called a governor. A governor in American English. I don't know if in Europe, but basically if you rent a U-Haul van, it won't let you go over 55 miles an hour.
Oh, like that. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, you can push the gas as hard as you want. That's how I feel about my beta blockers, my metoprolol.
Yeah.
You know, and in a way it's liberating because I know that my blood pressure is not going to spike when I go for my jog.
Exactly. That's a positive, you know, to being on them. And I'll see if I need them for life or if I'll get off them at one point. But I agree, Jack, it's actually pretty comforting to say, hey, I can go exercise and I can relax about that. I can do more or less, you know, I will be normally regulated into what is right for me. So that's a positive.
It is a positive. I will say, just like to play devil's advocate here, just because of what I heard, just because of what I heard at the Dallas Aorta conference, talking about, because we're on beta blockers, it is suppressing that, right? So we still need to be mindful of that total exhaustion that they don't want us to get to, because you can feel like you're not really pushing yourself as much, or your Garmin might say your heart rate or your blood pressure, whatever, is not as high, but you may still be exerting more than you think based on the numbers given because of your medications. So I just want to say to be mindful of that too.
And for Carmen, sure. That's where the little by little.
Yes, little by little.
Yeah, I think that's one thing. And I think the other thing for people is, if you're used to doing competitive sports, if you like to push yourself hard and you want to compete before surgery, right? If that's where you are, you want to lift really heavy, then that's more where you're into a more, you know, a little bit more transition where you need to go a little bit deeper with yourself to say, you know, I need to be cautious. I may actually have some restrictions that I don't like. And you need to deal with that, because the alternative is it's the risk. And of course, you can evaluate that yourself and say, what risks am I willing to take? But that's a more personal journey, right? But that's when it becomes more severe, because if I wanted to still compete or whatever, it would be more difficult. I've settled with that a long time ago, that I just want to exercise and stay healthy.
Yeah, good.
Joshua, any other more questions?
We do have just a few more here. Greer Schneider says, exercise helps a lot with stress and your mental well-being. Did you adopt any activities to help adapt to a different kind of exercise?
I would say there are, you know, I've added, that helped me as well, actually. I would say in the period from, we go back a year or so, so before coming, I actually started it before the initial finding that now surgery was here. In my general, you could say, training routine and stuff, I go biking. I can't run that more anymore because of a long elite career is not good for your back, but I can bike. So I do that in all kinds of forms, on the road, gravel biking. Did mountain biking before, but I won't do that in the same extent anymore because of the bleeding risks from taking the blood thinners. So I do skiing with my kids. I will still do that, but I will not do it and take risks. So no off-piste and stuff like that. So I think I can still do the same things, but I will moderate them more. And then one thing that I've really used in the past year or more is I've done more yoga. And I really dove into the mental side of that. So I've done a lot of work on meditation. And that has really helped me a lot. I think to center myself, working with all the emotions, but the subconscious side of that as well. That has been really, really good. both on a daily basis. I've done mental training for years as an athlete. So I've always had a good way of tuning into myself and tuning in both mentally and physically. But I really used some of those more, you could say, low intensity yoga sessions and meditation sessions and breathing sessions as part of this whole thing. And that has been really helpful, particularly actually post-surgery in the phase where you do have pain and where breathing can really help you. And those types of being able to relax yourself in that has been very helpful.
That's an excellent answer.
Mm-hmm.
And so Ed Long has something to share here. He says, I had my repair on Valentine's Day last year. I lost 80 pounds, but have a lot more to go. I felt down at times looking at people be in the hospital for a week and going home and walking and biking. I was in the hospital for a month. I wasn't able to get cardiac rehab, but weeks later I got PT. I lost a lot of muscle. I feel so much better, but scared about getting into lifting and doing some more active things. I'm thankful to hear your story. Thank you for sharing.
And you are a warrior, man. That is a journey. So good on you to get into exercise. That is super cool.
And we don't all dance out of the hospital.
No.
Torbjorn had a picture of on a bike in the hallway in the hospital, I think. I don't know how long in that one. I was not getting on a bike.
No. And I think at one point, I think me being, you could say, younger and trained, etc., it has been a positive on some points and a downside on other points. But I definitely, respect them. I think it's just amazing. There's some of you that have had some really complex surgeries, and you need all our love and support to go through that and to come back to a life that is active.
Yeah. Okay. Here's the last. I have a last question, and then maybe Carmen can take us out. All right. So I read that Paula Radcliffe, remember the British marathoner? I heard that over the weekend she was in Tokyo and had done a marathon for the first time in like 15 years or something like that. And her time was okay. It was okay, but it wasn't, wasn't like the old days. If you look down the pike 3, 4, 5 years, do you see yourself wanting? I mean, and you're kind of unique. You're not unique, but in your own story, you haven't dissected. You have a repair. You haven't identified a genetic component. Do you ever think about doing an endurance event?
I've had the thought pre-surgery, and there's one event that I want, and it's a crazy, very extreme event, but I've decided, I'm not there. And I think for two reasons, it was, I don't know if you know, but there's a Norseman triathlon, which is a very extreme form of Ironman where and I love Norway. I love the Nordic countries. It's where I live. And that one was kind of be a testament to I'm back. But I've actually come to that's not, I don't want to pursue that for a couple of reasons. One is my heart has been through a lot of stuff. It is retired now. And I think that is fine by me.
Is that the one? Is that the one where you swim in a fjord and it's like the icy cold water?
Yes, and you finish running uphill for 25 kilometers. So that's a crazy event, but I really, it's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. And I've been a coach to an athlete going through it once, and I absolutely love the venue. Yeah. It's a very small race, and I love it. That's the only one that I was thinking about. Other than that, I like being out by myself or with friends. I've done all the competition I need in my life, and I've had more than I could dream of from that. And the second thing is my body is not, I need to do a lot of work to keep pain-free in my back and my neck and all that stuff. And I don't want to put myself or my family actually through that again. So I've decided I'm retired. I retired 15 years ago, and I'm still retired.
Well, Jack, is that all the questions that we have to go then? Yeah. All right. Well, Torbjorn, I am so glad that you came to share your story with us today. Such an inspiring story, and your insight and perspective from everything, your adaptation, your mental health, and everything has just been such a wonderful story. So thank you for sharing with us. And I just want to remind everyone that Dr. Prakash will be doing our next interview with us on March the 12th. So stay tuned for that. And I did just want to throw out also that he will be on the bi-monthly meeting for Ask a Doctor with Aortic Hope on March 18th as well. So you can catch both of those coming up soon. But again, thank you to our guest, and we will see you guys the next time.
Torbjorn, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.